Good evening, everyone. I am Betsy Fischer Martin, Executive Director of the Women in Politics Institute at American University, and welcome to another installment of our virtual series, Women on Wednesdays, which we started over the summer, and we are excited to continue this fall as we return to our virtual campus. Happy Women's Equality Day to everyone. 100 years ago today, the 19th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified, granting women the right to vote. So it's extra special that we get to have this conversation today. To those of you new to one of our events, WPI is a nonprofit and nonpartisan institute in AU's School of Public Affairs that aims to close the gender gap in political leadership. And we offer academic and practical training, and we facilitate research and discussions like this on women in politics. So thank you for being a part of this evening. So on this special day, we are delighted to have with us the co-editors of the new book, Suffrage at 100, Women in American Politics Since 1920. They bring together 22 scholars to take stock of so many aspects of women's engagement in electoral politics over the past 100 years. So Dr. Stacie Taranto is an associate professor at Ramapo College in New Jersey. And Dr. Leandra Zarnow is an assistant professor of history at the University of Houston. And she has fled the storm and is joining us from San Antonio this evening. So we certainly hope everybody is going to be okay in Houston. We want to make this event as interactive as possible. So I will say plenty of time for your questions. On the bottom of the screen, you'll notice a button to ask a question. Please feel free to do so during the course of our discussion. And you can also upvote other people's questions that you may be interested in as well. And we'll save plenty of time for that. Also, in the middle of the screen, you'll see a green button that will open up a new window to a link to order a copy of the book. And if you miss any of this discussion or you want to share it with friends, a replay will be available at the very same link that you used to register for the event. So Stacie and Leandra, welcome, and congrats on the book.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So the title is Suffrage at 100. So let me start by asking each of you to characterize where we are politically as women 100 years after winning the right to vote.
So in 1971, the National Women's Political Caucus was founded specifically to elect more women, to have more gender parity in American politics at all levels. And when they were founded in 1971, they set a goal of 50-50 gender parity by 2020, by today. And we're nowhere near. And the funny thing is, when they set that goal, they didn't even think that was ambitious. They thought 50 years out from now, women, it was on the heels of the women's movement, or sort of in the middle of the women's movement. They thought that'll be easy to meet that goal. And again, we're about a quarter of Congress are women. So I'm optimistic about it. We're as far as we've been, but we're just not there yet.
Leandra, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I also think that today, Women's Equality Day, a day that really actually became a holiday in 1973. Bella Abzug was, very much responsible in Congress for that happening. I think it's important to reflect that it seems like every 50 years, 100 years, we're thinking about women's vote and how far we've come, but also the unfinished business. And so I think it's important to also think today about the Women's Strike for Equality that happened in 1970. And there were 3 specific goals of the over 100,000 women that came out to march that day. Basically, universal childcare, we still don't have that. Equal opportunity in the workplace, we're moving there, but we still don't have equal pay for equal work. And then free abortion on demand. And we can see that, there's been so much work to chisel away from Roe v. Wade. And so these are tenuous goals and tenuous opportunities for us to still strive for. And so I think that's really, really important on this in this particular moment. I also think it's important for us to think about how far we have gotten with the vice presidential pick of Kamala Harris. Yeah. But at the same time, why did it take 100 years? For this to happen? And so I'm really just always struck by the words of Dorothy Height, who was the president of the National Council of Negro Women. And I just want to read a quote to you because I just think it's important to really sit with today. And she said, when the 1965 Voting Rights Act was passed, and this was essentially the moment of universal women's suffrage. She said, 50 years ago, women got suffrage, but it took lynching, bombing, the Civil Rights Movement, and the Voting Rights Act to get it for Black women and for Black people. And I think we need to be really mindful of how many people don't have access to voting right now. You know, how scary this mail-in voting controversy has come for us as we're looking towards November.
You mentioned earlier Bella Abzug, and I want to ask you guys because you start in the introduction of the book at kind of the midway point, so 50 years ago in 1970, and you're looking at two different women at that point running for Congress that had one thing in common, and you write they agreed on politics had long been a male pursuit sorely in need of more women. And so I want to ask you about these two women. Each of you are experts on one of them, and share your thoughts about where we were at this midway point in 1970. And of course, that's Phyllis Schlafly there on the left of your screen, and Bella Abzug. And talk to us about what happened in that year that was a little bit of a turning point in that since suffrage and what happened in 1970.
Yeah, so they actually both ran for Congress on the same slogan of a woman's place in the House of Representatives. And when I was first doing research as a biographer of Bella Abzug, I was just struck by that. And, you know, really thought a lot about why could Bella Abzug gain office in New York City when Phyllis Schlafly could not in Illinois. And that's just always been something that I've thought about. And so Stacie's interviewed Phyllis Schlafly for her book. So do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it really shows that, you know, today you can look at the breakdown of women in elected office, and you can see that there are many more women in elected office in the Democratic Party. But I think this shows that in the 1970s, that wasn't always the case, right? And that both parties eschewed women for so long, right? 1970 is the 50th anniversary of suffrage. But, you know, just because women got the right to vote in 1920, it didn't change the fact that the ideal political citizen in America from its founding was a white male, right? Just because they got the right to vote doesn't mean that all of a sudden the old boys club opened up the doors and said, women, we want you to serve alongside us equally. And so, you know, both of these women in particular, for so long, the Democratic and Republican parties after World War II were almost mirror images of each other, more centrist, both of them. Phyllis Schlafly's on the right wing trying to push the Republican Party further rightward. Bella Abzug's on the left wing of the Democratic Party trying to push the Democratic Party more leftward, leading to the intense political partisanship that we know today. And, you know, as a way to try to further that process for those activist movements, they said, wait a minute, let women in. You'll have, you know, Phyllis Schlafly saying you want the right to grow, let women in. So she's sort of using that moment, women's increased participation in politics to try to also further conservative Republican politics. And no one's listening to either of them really, right? So it really, that's where we were then. And in some ways it hasn't changed as much as we would hope it had since then.
And what's really remarkable is that they're actually using some of the same language. They both don't want to be doorbell pushers in their respective parties, and they're pushing for this change well before they're running for Congress themselves. And so, you know, they had been on the political scene really throughout the 1960s. Bella Abzug in Women's Strike for Peace was pushing for gender parity alongside peace. And this was a disarmament movement. It started in 1961. So this is well before the anti-war movement had developed. And then in the Dump Johnson campaign, she's asking, you know, political advisors, where are the women? As she's, you know, has the ear of Robert Kennedy and Eugene McCarthy and all of these men. She got sick of basically being their key, you know, one of their key political advisors, and decided to ultimately get out front. So that realization, is being developed on both sides all through the 1960s, and then ultimately 1970 is this moment, I think, where there's an awakening happening along, across the ideological spectrum. And so one thing they could actually agree on was that women are political beings, and are extremely adept in the political arena and need to be there.
I wanted to ask you, while we're talking about them, about the series Mrs. America. I know a lot of folks watch that. What are your thoughts as historians on the series? And this is, of course, Phyllis Schlafly here and Bella Abzug, the characters that played them in the series. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I thought it was fantastic. There were some minor inaccuracies, but of course, you also have to entertain people because this is Hollywood. But just for me, even when I started working on, my first book was on conservative women, sort of the women in the different states that Phyllis Schlafly led, if you were watching the show. And just, around 2008, when I was starting the project, nobody, not my age, I'm in my 40s, nobody knew who Phyllis Schlafly was. So on one level, I just thought it was great so that, now everyone was talking about it. I couldn't even believe that events that I had once read about in the archive were now the stuff of, Hollywood, really. So that was really exciting to see. I think one really vivid scene, if folks saw the show, that relates to what we were just talking about. There's a moment when Phyllis Schlafly is with Barry Goldwater and other men who are trying to push the Republican Party further rightward. And she's talking about foreign policy, which is really just the opposite of Bella. She wanted as much nuclear war as possible, as much nuclear arms as possible. And she's trying to talk about that. And they're kind of just, whatever, Phyllis, and they're not listening to her. And you can see in that series that she realizes, okay, they're only going to listen to me if I talk about women's issues. So, of course, that meant that she opposed the ERA eventually, even as she herself, ironically, was doing a lot of work to normalize women in politics, because she, in the 70s, was one of the best-known women in American politics, even as she was out there campaigning on women not having fewer rights.
Right. And I love that Davi Waller also had Phyllis Schlafly go to law school during the series. And I always find that such a fascinating part of Schlafly's background that hasn't really gotten much play, but she was really upset with the fact that she kept facing off all of these feminist lawyers. Bella Abzug was a pretty amazing lawyer. There were so many others, that are featured in the Mrs. America show. And so that really, I thought, brought nuance to Phyllis Schlafly in a way that I haven't seen before. I do think, though, however, that the show does sustain a really, really problematic media trope, which is the cat fight. Mm-hmm. And in fact, Gloria Steinem and Eleanor Smeal recently wrote an op-ed in the LA Times really taking the show to task about this. And so some of the similarities between these women who are all very political and very, savvy organizers are downplayed as a result of really trying to pit the two sides against each other. And certainly they were in huge contestation over the Equal Rights Amendment passing. And it was, a really important fight to be had to figure out, what will women's status be in the 1970s, but downplaying that, I think the nuance and the complexity of the organizing on the side of the feminists was something that the show unfortunately did.
I wanted to ask you, you alluded to this a little bit, but you all talk about the gendering of political issues. And one of the reasons you all write that women had difficulty breaking into that male-dominated space is because of the gendering of political issues. What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, literally, we talk about systemic racism, which is absolutely real. There's also systemic sexism. And our American political system was literally founded on women's exclusion. The notion was women don't need the vote or to be in elected office because they belong in the home, raising the next generation of leaders. Now, of course, this concept only really applied to wealthier white women, the women whose sons the founders wanted to lead the nation going forward. But, that was sort of the idea, that women belonged in the home. And so women tried so long, for over 75 years, really since the founding, to attain suffrage. And when they made equality arguments, give us the vote, we are equal, they found that they weren't getting very far. So by the late 19th century, you see a lot of suffragists who are saying, give us the vote. We know our lane. We know we belong in the home. We only need the vote so that we can put more effective pressure on legislators to get them to pass legislation that's important to us as women, legislation that has to do with family and children. So for so long, women were forced to present their politics in these gendered terms, is really what we're talking about. Historians, we call it maternalist politics. Mm-hmm. They presented themselves as public mothers. That's why we need the vote. Now, this is a double-edged sword, right? Because the guys in power wouldn't listen to them when they said, we want a seat at the table, we're equal. They only listened when they said, we want the vote, we want a seat at the table to help women and children. So that's the only way the guys would listen to them, but it also normalized this idea that women really belong in the home, that their true lane is that of domesticity and motherhood. And, we still see that legacy today, that both the nation being founded on that notion and then women themselves perpetuating that notion. Ironically, they wanted equality, but they used that to get equality. They found that to be a very effective way to be heard.
And it really, unfortunately, fed into thinking about women in this place and keeping them in this particular place in politics. And so, when we were putting this book together, we were reading a lot of articles about political discourse, and I kept coming across all of these quotes that are just crazy from campaigns. And so one in 1924 was, a woman's place in politics is about 4 feet from the kitchen sink. And so this was, a governor or a guy running for governor in Kansas, and that was his line. And so women are fine in politics if they have a special place in politics. And so this is the evolution, essentially, right after women get the vote, of women's issues. Women can be in politics if they're not doing foreign affairs, if they're dealing with, more maternalist elements, that's fine. Let's just think that this is not in our politics any longer. The Women's March of 2017 comes along, and a New Jersey politician is asked by a reporter, what do you think of this? And he says, will the women's protest end in time for them to cook dinner? This is still really the language that is circulating. I think there's a shift happening, a cultural shift happening, and there's much more, calling out of this kind of thing, but it has been a centerpiece to our political discourse for many years.
One of my favorite chapters in the book was written by Dr. Joanna Newman, who we've had do some stuff with the Institute before. And she writes about, speaking of sayings, she writes about Ruth McCormick, who you see here was the first woman on the cover of Time magazine. And the chapter is called My Money's on the Mayor. Give us a little sense of who Ruth McCormick was and what was historic about what she did in terms of running. She was a member of the House, but she also made a big run for the Senate in 1930.
Yeah, so she comes from this long line of, male politician, big family in Illinois. Her father, Teddy Roosevelt, actually made that comment, in thinking about and really providing some accolades to her because she was involved in her father's campaign and her husband's campaign. And he tragically passed away of suicide, actually, after he lost a race. And so she decides to run for office 3 years later. And she gained a local office initially. She was also very involved in the suffrage movement in Illinois. And ultimately, she's in the House of Representatives in 1928. And then she, decides to run for Senate after one term. And so, this is huge. This is historic, this particular run. She lost by 750,000 votes. So huge landslide loss, actually. And there's a whole range of reasons. that kind of brings forward. And so she, she's for prohibition when many of her voters are not. She has a scandal that Joanna equates to Benghazi that she's dealing with while the Senate race is developing. So, it's interesting the parallels that she makes in this particular chapter. And, she's quite wealthy, and she's, running during the Great Depression as a Republican candidate. And loses when many, Republicans did in a particular, not great midterm for them. But the other thing that is really important, I think, to bring out is that she's trying to run on an equal rights argument, and she's trying to move away from this maternalist argument in her particular campaign. But she keeps getting cornered as Mrs. McCormick, and she said, I don't want anyone to vote for me because I'm a woman, and I don't want to have anyone vote against me because I'm a woman. So she's trying to basically say this shouldn't matter. The issues should matter, and she cannot convince voters of that.
Speaking of kind of the position that women find themselves in, you also have a chapter in there about widowhood, talking about how really that was really one of the surest entry points for women in this kind of early years. Either they took the seats of their husband if the husband passed away. And the essay in the book is called "A Dead Husband is a Better Ticket to Congress Than a Log Cabin."
Such a great line.
Yeah, such a great line. I think I guess part of that speaks to what we were talking about, the way that political citizenship is, the foundation of political citizenship is such that, a white male is the politician, a woman belongs in the home. And, what better way to get voters to elect you than to run as the literal representation of that home, that family, right? So it's not surprising at all that women would gain entry point or be most acceptable if they are thought of as representing the interests of their husband who had passed on.
Right. Yeah, and Ruth McCormick is an example of this, right? And when she decides to fall out of that usual and tries, the usual course and tries to remake herself as a politician in her own right, that's essentially when voters are turning away from her.
And going back to the 70s again, so we talked about the 20s and 30s, and we're jumping back to the 70s. There's also a great chapter in here about Ms. Magazine. And Gloria Steinem, and the essay was written by Anna Stevenson, and she writes, Ms. Magazine was an important but overlooked political primer born of the women's movement, but very much engages with political rights that help bridge the space between political knowledge and action. How did Ms. become such a cultural phenomenon and really turn into not just publishing feminist content, but becoming a feminist organization?
Yeah, I mean, it was designed to be one from the get-go, and that was Gloria Steinem and the other co-founders their point, really. And Steinem, was very involved in democratic politics well before Ms. came into being, and so she came to that work with that idea in mind. So it absolutely was a political primer by design, but also it was a conscience-raising, tool. In between the fold. And so the idea was to completely blow up what women's magazines were like, all the way down to a non-hierarchical women-led staff with really different kinds of, meetings that they had. They had an all-women advertising team, and they were trying to push advertisers from the auto industry, from electronics, to actually have ads in their magazines so that it would they would ultimately see women as consumers for their products, these really male-dominated industries. And so it was incredibly transformative in its goals, but also what was so, I think, successful for this magazine was it actually was sold on newsstands and ultimately was purchased across the heartland. And so it brought the movement to all of these enclaves throughout the United States that didn't have access to New York City or to San Francisco or to Washington, D.C., some of the places where women's liberation groups really sprouted. And also democratic politics especially had a place in the magazine. And so, for instance, in 1972, when Shirley Chisholm runs for president, but also Sissy Farenthold is nominated on the floor for the vice presidency, just right after that point, there's a whole feature article in Mid Magazine about that. And also, it was a history book. And that's something that Anna Stevenson really brings attention to. And so the feature Lost Woman, for instance, drawing focus back to suffragists, but also a whole other slew of women characters that are, wonderful sojourners in our history.
Yeah, and having studied Phyllis Schlafly, she talked a lot about Ms. And what's interesting is she tries to position it as this feminist magazine that's about bashing the home and bashing family, because of course the way that she's running against feminism, she doesn't want to overtly, as she organizes across the country, say I'm against women's rights. She says instead I'm for the family, and by that pro-family or family values, meaning a woman should play a traditional role in the family. And what's interesting though is absolutely wrong. There were many articles in Ms. about raising children, about motherhood. Some of it was making women aware of new legislation that would help, women who could now initiate divorce, let's say, or women who may find themselves needing to go into the workforce again, and there were new laws to passed to help them with to fund some training for them. But it was very interested in the family and the home, but making it a space of equality, right? Like they weren't interested in you buying your daughter dresses and little kitchens only, right? They were interested in you following your children's interests and not having gendered toys in the first place, right? So I always think that's interesting, is that it was meant to reach that housewife in the Midwest as much as it was the woman wanting to run for Congress in New York.
Do you want the word?
And men too.
Oh, I was just going to say that Alan Alda liked to write wrote a column for Ms., for instance, and so men too were really represented in the magazine.
Do you all think that the word feminist today has the same meaning as it did in 1970?
Well, I think that unfortunately, and Susan Faluti writes about this wonderfully in Backlash, but there was essentially a very concerted effort, starting in the 1970s to paint feminism as something bad, and so for so many years there was the idea. I mean, when we first started teaching, came across students that would say, "I'm not a feminist, but," and then they would talk about their experience. And then also there was, womanists who didn't want to use the term feminist because they didn't feel that feminism was representative of their particular intersectional interests. And so there was a lot of, kind of race, class, and gender divides that ultimately have clouded the use of feminists and weighted that word, rightfully so. So, however, I think the Women's March has shifted things quite a bit, and more young women especially are willing to take on that term, and wear it as a badge of honor.
Right.
I've seen that in my classes, and I think that in moments when there's heightened women's activism, there's all of a sudden a heightened interest in women's history. I mean, I saw just an uptick in my classes that I teach. And when people actually study what feminism was and, what it wasn't, I think they're more willing to embrace it. So I think, a moment like today where there's a focus on history, right, just invites you to engage with that history and to find out what it's about and to maybe embrace a term like feminism. So,
and not all suffragists were feminists,
right,
or used the term feminist either. And so even at the turn of the century, there was like a whole group of women who wanted to see a socialist feminist state, and they thought that was the end goal, and suffrage was one of many political demands and interests. So I think that's important to remember too.
You mentioned earlier Shirley Chisholm, and I want to get your thoughts on her, because there's another great chapter in the book about it's called On the Shirley Chisholm Trail, and her contribution as a catalyst for change for women in this country, and for African American women especially.
Yes. So Shirley Chisholm, she was the first African-American woman elected to Congress. She was elected from Brooklyn in 1968. And when she gets to Congress, she's immediately put on the Agricultural Committee. Of course, she protests because she's representing urban Brooklyn, right? But, that just shows again why representation is important, right? The image of a Black woman called to mind for white men in power, particularly Southern men, of Black women in agricultural fields, right? She's ultimately put on the Educational Committee, which she appreciates as an educator. And she is a founder of one of the founders of the National Women's Political Caucus in 1971. She does a lot of work with Bella Abzug, promoting. They actually get us further than anyone's ever gotten with the child care bill. It actually passes Congress in 1971, only to be vetoed by Richard Nixon, who sees his party moving rightward, the Republican Party, around family values, and he vetoes federally funded child care. So she goes to run for president, and her slogan is "Unbought and Unbossed," meaning she's not a member of the old boys club by any way. I mean, she's has many marginal identities, right? She's an immigrant, came from Barbados. She is a Black woman. She's a woman in politics. And interestingly, she says after running for president that she faced more sexism than racism, more barriers as a woman than as an African American in that race. But she's running to win, right? Like, this wasn't a symbolic campaign for her. Did she know she probably wasn't going to win? Probably, but this is not a statement campaign. This is to try to put her issues forward, and she doesn't, she doesn't obviously get the nomination. It actually causes a few splits within the women's movement. Leandra can talk even more about that potentially, because some people say, should we support her in the Democratic primary? She doesn't have a chance, or should we back the guy who has a better chance to govern because he seems friendly to the policy proposals we're putting forward? So actually causes a bit of a split in the movement. But her campaign did so much work, and also that year Betsy Mink ran as well. We have a chapter on her, and it helped to normalize what a politician was, and she was conscious of that legacy as well. So it's a really important campaign.
And I think also sometimes we forget about who is staffing these campaigns, who are the volunteers. And for those who were involved in the Chisholm campaign, it was such an important spark of political interest and political careers going forward. And I would love to see a study that just specifically looks at her campaign and all of the people that were inspired to move forward in their own lives and their own politics after her.
We're going to go to questions in just a few minutes, so if you guys have other questions, please be sure to go ahead and put those into the question queue. But I wanted to ask you, there's another chapter in the book called Putting Women on a Pedestal. And just this morning in Central Park, they unveiled the new statue in the park. I think it was on the Today Show this morning, and finally, there are 3 women joining the other 3 women in the park who are Mother Goose, Shakespeare's Juliet, and my other favorite, Alice in Wonderland. So
I know.
Talk to us about that.
I know. Can you believe it? I mean, people who know Central Park, there's statues everywhere, right? A statue of a dog who existed in real life, Balto, right? And there were no actual women. And so actually, sort of the evolution of the statue roughly follows the timeline of this book. When we were starting to put it together in 2018, it was unveiled in anticipation of today, the Centennial, that the committee for Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, their statue fund, they revealed that they were making progress towards having a statue that would have Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony on it. Now, this is in 2018 as Black Lives Matter, and people said, well, that's great that they're going to be women, but first of all, those are 2 white women, and among white women who were in the suffrage movement in the 19th century. Those two have many quotes, basically after women were left out of the 15th Amendment, and they thought that was a potential opportunity for women to get suffrage along with Black men, the 15th Amendment. Women were left out of the amendment. And after that, Stanton and Anthony, they advanced a politics for white women only to get the vote. They started appealing to segregationists and saying, can you believe Black men, inferiors, are voting and women like us are not? It didn't get them suffrage, but if you're going to pick two women especially. And so a movement came afoot in the past 2 years to add Sojourner Truth to the statue, as she was added, and it was unveiled today. But again, this idea of representation, it really matters. I mean, the fact we're a political system built on women's exclusion, and you can actually see that in our infrastructure. That piece in our book by Monica Mercado, it actually talks about studies that women started doing going back to the women's movement in the 70s and into the 90s on just how many statues there were in America and how few there were on women. So this is an important marker.
Yeah.
And it ended up, I think, with a better result than it would have otherwise had there not been the activism.
I think she said recent counts are approximately 5,200 historical statues in the U.S., and women represent less than 8% of those.
Yeah. Wow.
Right. So just like, it's important to see Kamala Harris.
Yes.
In all of the next number of weeks, it's important to see women in the American landscape, and we just don't at this level. And so there have been some efforts around the Centennial to change that, but I would argue few and far between. And hopefully we'll really think about, and support these statue projects that require a lot of financial support. And one other that I'd love to see happen is a statue for Ida B. Wells. One of her descendants is really pushing this, in I believe Chicago, and it would be incredible to really see that happen. And so if anyone has a GoFundMe going for that, I'm not sure. I should have looked that up before we got on here, but I would love to see that soon too.
Before we go to the questions, one more question for you guys. I want to get your thoughts sort of in this political year of 2020. We've seen so much in terms of women in politics. 6 women obviously running for the Democratic primary nomination. We now have a vice presidential candidate. And I just want to get your thoughts on what that means for the future of women in politics, and what will be the significance, especially too, if the Biden-Harris ticket is elected and she is vice president.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, first of all, we're not at full gender parity in American politics, but it would have been unimaginable for Kamala Harris or someone like her to be a VP pick 100 years ago, right? I mean, and even when her name was announced a few weeks ago, a lot of the headlines in the major newspapers were like safe pick, along the lines of, he went with the safe pick, Kamala Harris. And, that's amazing that is considered a so-called safe pick. You even just, so there's such an opportunity, right? If she can be a true partner to Biden, and there's every indication that she may be able to, but if she can be a true partner and model on the national stage and the international stage, the first woman in an executive office and what that looks like, I think that's going to echo, throughout the country for years to come, generations to come. A lot of people talk about in politics today, especially women who are running in this historic 1992 midterms, they talked about the importance of seeing Shirley Chisholm run for president in their younger years. And so you can imagine the seeds that might be planted now, just by her being on the ticket.
I absolutely agree with Stacie. I think it's fabulous that there were 6 really incredible candidates. It was amazingly hard to decide, which to support and all to support. But also I think it's important to be mindful at this 100-year mark, how far we need to go. And, getting to the 19th Amendment took, over 70 years, but we're now at 100, to get voting power into equal political power. And so why is it that this part of this struggle for full political citizenship and political representation and a seat at the table is still a struggle in the United States? I think at this moment we could really think about that and maybe refocus.
Well, that's a good segue to our first question here from Caitlin, who wants to know what are the next steps for women in politics? What is the next 100 years going to hold for gender equality?
Right. So historians have trouble with this kind of question because we aren't political scientists for a reason. So maybe you can help us out with this, Betsy. But I do think that all of these organizations that have come forward, like She Should Run and these perfectly named organizations that are really trying to, train candidates and encourage candidates are an extremely important step, because the party patronage for many years has not been focused on seeing women as viable candidates to take on incumbents. Has been something that's really, really huge. And so, having these organizations that really train and excite and interest candidates, I think, is important. Stacie?
Yeah, and I think sort of you were touching on that. The money is a big piece of this too, right? And I think because women aren't the insiders, so it's harder for them to do those high dollar donations. So I think this migration towards, helped by the internet and such in recent years, towards smaller contributions is going to help women, I think, right? So it's eventually we want to get to the point where money is less important in politics. I think that's a goal that a lot of people have, and I think that would help women as well. But this grassroots moment and the ability to raise money online so easily, I think, you look at AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, you look at her campaign, right, and you look at how important grassroots campaigning was for her. And so I think I'm encouraged going forward, but I think that's a big piece of it too.
I also think that as historians, though, we do have a responsibility in this game, which is to draw focus to women who have run in the past. Mm-hmm. And for instance, in the year 1970, 1972, 1974, these were all essentially marked as years of the women, because there were thousands of women running, and we don't know any of their stories. So for those of you who are history buffs out there, please start telling these stories and trying to discover and read, and blog about or post about, these women of the past too.
Well, and that's what we were talking a little earlier about too, in this moment of the Suffrage Centennial, how much more awareness and discussions about even the fight for the right to vote. A lot of this is not even taught in schools. I don't know about you guys, but maybe had a page in a history book, maybe in like 6th grade civics, but that's it. And so there is this much more awareness now, I think, in this past year. Wouldn't you agree?
Absolutely. And I was saying I'm seeing an uptick in my classes. And really in the last 5 years, there was a point before around like 2010 where I was being encouraged to name all women's history courses gender history, just like more neutral. And of course, in a women's history, you're always talking about the way that gender is configured in any given moment. So it's not a terrible thing to rename, but I do think now there's, a focus, like I said, in moments of activism, you want to know, like, are we really the only ones who ever did this? Or why are we still fighting for something that we think is so basic now? And that just draws you towards the history, I think. Mm-hmm. So
here's a question from Jessica. We touched on this a little bit earlier, but she says the suffragists were obviously instrumental in earning the right to vote for white women. Can you speak to the argument about the racial discrimination of the suffrage movement and how we can celebrate suffrage while acknowledging the struggle of women of color faced for decades after 1920?
Right. I think that it's really important to commemorate this particular holiday, but not celebrate it. And one thing that I think has been really powerful in terms of our public conversation we're having is to, in fact, revisit suffrage history and change it so that it is no longer the history that Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony wrote themselves, because essentially first historians looked to these 3 volumes, I believe it is, mega histories that was essentially memoirs. And Lisa Tetrault's, book, The Myth of Seneca Falls, really does an incredible job of demystifying what has become a leading, mythology of how we think about the suffrage movement. And so I think it's really, really important to draw focus to all of the, the range of suffragists, African American suffragists, Chinese American suffragists, Native American suffragists, and some of the exhibits in Washington, D.C. actually, I was very pleased to see do in fact tell this larger, broader tapestry. And so we need to acknowledge the skeletons in the closet of, people like our great, supposed great heroes like Stanton and Anthony, who we have put on pedestals and say, they were people of their times. They were highly, xenophobic, and I don't care if you're friends with Frederick Douglass, if you're using racist, analogies to push for white women's suffrage, that's a problem.
Here's a question from Caitlin. She wants to know, was there anything that surprised you while writing and editing this book?
Well, the one great thing about this book, we sort of just put a call, the way it works in academic publishing, we sort of put a call out there in 2018, and we said, all right, the Centennial's coming up, scholars, if you write about any aspect of women in American politics since 1920, write to us. Let us know why your chapter, your work should be included in this book. And it wasn't even really by design, but we just got these amazing stories that really haven't been told yet, just by chance. That's who contributed, who wanted to be in this volume. And so I think that's what I've just learned so much myself in editing this volume about players that I never knew about. Of course, we have the big campaigns for historians like Chisholm, but Betsy Taranto Mink as well, and others who ran for office. That's what excites me about this collection in this history.
And the other thing I think that's important to draw focus to is that friendship is the center of this book, and we met actually when we were working on our respective books in the archives, and realized that we were kind of political junkies, and that we were really interested in thinking about women in politics, and there hadn't been a lot of focus on women's political history. And in fact, our book is trying to make the case for the need for a really broad field, in this area, and a lot of other historians to join our kind of little sisterhood that we're forming over here. But it's important to also think about the effective relationships that these activists and these kind of political women, had, and how they really supported each other as they were working in, these spaces that were highly male dominated, and they created their kitchens as political spaces. They created hallways as their political spaces, because they weren't actually being invited to be insiders in politics.
Okay, let's see. We've got a couple more questions here. Here's one from Cookie. She says, how do you think the current pandemic is affecting the fight for women's equality, especially regarding childcare and work?
You don't have to tell me about that. I'm living it. What I think is interesting is that, for so often the refrain is, who cares about politics? That doesn't have anything to do with my life. I don't care which party's in office. My life kind of stays the same. I think that in this moment, it has been really clear that people are maybe consuming more media, or they're at home, but also that we have a system of unequal childcare. This confluence of issues is becoming really clear, right? I know a lot of people who had to take a break, go on furlough voluntarily, which is fortunate if you're doing it voluntarily, but someone had to take care of the kids because childcare centers are closing. And I would say, well, in my world, maybe 10 times out of 10, it's the wife, the mother, because she makes less, right? So there is a connection between, unequal pay and our childcare not being fully funded, right? And I think a pandemic, a moment of crisis, is really where you're seeing that really clearly, and you're seeing that it's putting a spotlight on some of these inequities, absolutely, and how they're interconnected.
Yeah.
And also, our society has shifted towards a feminization of the economy and poverty. And so we're also seeing very clearly that, huge amount of essential workers are predominantly poor women of color, and aren't, getting any support for these services that are so necessary, like childcare, and have to make choices that are hard choices about who's going to stay home and if that's even a possibility.
Right. Okay, here's a question from Caitlin Jones, who says, many feminists who organized during the 1960s and 70s contend that the ERA failed because of opposition and lobbying by the insurance industry rather than the mobilization of Phyllis Schlafly and the anti-ERA activists. As historians, what do you think of that perspective?
Right. Yeah. And we sort of alluded to it, but Eleanor Smeal, a former president of the National Organization for Women, and Gloria Steinem, they wrote about, in talking about how they didn't like the show Mrs. America, they talked about how it gave too much agency, too much power to Phyllis Schlafly. I know Gloria Steinem's been saying that all along, like even back in the 70s, that, the ERA is not failing because of Phyllis Schlafly alone. But I have to say that having studied the women who Phyllis Schlafly organized, I have to say that there were a lot of women who very passionately did go out there to defeat it. They didn't understand it, they didn't understand what it actually would have done. But I don't know that I buy that necessarily, because I hate to be criticizing my hero, one of my Gloria Steinem, and telling her that I know better, but just having listened to the voices of the women who believed what Phyllis was saying and just how personal it was to them, I think they did a lot of work to reject it. And actually in New York State, when the federal ERA was stalled, New York State said, let's go, because there was such a large contingent of feminists and feminist politicians in New York, they said, let's go ahead and pass a state ERA while we wait for this federal one to pass. And in the home of Betty Friedan and Gloria Steinem and Shirley Chisholm, that failed because of the women I studied and wrote about. They actually defeated it right in New York State. So maybe that had something to do with it, surely, because as we learned later with Obamacare, the insurance industry made a lot of money on treating women differently as consumers. But I do think women did a lot of work to defeat that themselves, based on things that Phyllis told them that were not factual.
Here is our last question. This is also from Caitlin, who says, how does the activism of trans women and non-binary people factor into the trajectory of women's political history?
That's a really important question. And I think that there's some historians right now that are working on the interplay between the trans and LGBT, organizing and gay liberation, as it was called at the time, and women's liberation. There was a lot of overlap and a lot of, continuity actually in these streams that were working, sometimes, separate, but alongside each other. So we don't know all of those histories yet, and I'm really excited to see some of that work developing.
Anything you want to add, Stace?
Yeah, no, I think that's really exciting, right? One of the things, though, the thing is about history and uncovering it, sometimes it's hard to, the more marginalized you were by your society at the time, the harder it actually is for us to find your sources, right? Because we were trying to hide that. So that's why I'm really excited by some of this newer work, because they're having to work harder to find the sources, right? And to stitch together that history. And it exists, and it's important to know that history so that you don't think this is just like a new thing to come about, today, right?
Great. Before we go, though, I want to let everybody know about two more suffrage-related events that we have coming up in the next 2 weeks. Next week, we are going to have Dr. Martha Jones, is a professor at Johns Hopkins, and she's going to be here to talk about her new book, Vanguard. It's getting a lot of really great reviews. I think it's actually out in the next couple of days. So I would encourage anyone who's interested to join us next week for that. And then the week after that, we are going to talk to former journalists Ellen Goodman and Lynn Scherer, who are co-hosting a new podcast called She Votes. There's a couple episodes out already that are really great and kind of takes you back into suffrage, the battle for the ballot, talks about a lot of different aspects of the suffrage movement, different stories, and it's really well put together and fun to listen to. So I encourage you to join us for that as well. We really appreciate you guys being here to talk to us. Stacie and Leandra, you all have been terrific. Your book is amazing. Congratulations on all of your hard work that you put into it. It's now finally here.
It's surreal that today's the Centennial. We've been anticipating it forever.
I know, and it was fun to spend Women's Equality Day with you both, and for everybody in the audience, we really appreciate you all being here, and have a great rest of the week, and hopefully we'll see folks back next Wednesday at 6 o'clock.
Thank you.
Thank you so much
for joining us this evening.
Thank you, everybody.
Take care.
Take care.